So, is it on now? Okay. Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's a beautiful morning today, Sunday morning, and I normally wouldn't go about telling you this, but it is my birthday today. We had, but that I'm telling you that for a different reason, not for the cheers. We did. We had the poets coming out in the house today. I heard DAD 43, that poem. So that's where I'm at today. And in case you don't believe me, I can prove it to you. Right now, on the second to last stair, right before the door to our garage, right now is my bag with my Bible in it and my notes. So that's the situation. It's a little bit embarrassing, but we'll go on an adventure together today. We'll see. It could be, that means either really long or really short, right? So we'll find out which one that is. And it was a really good morning too. Wasn't expecting that. I had some time this morning. I was just doing a little birthday reflection, and speaking of embarrassing, I wrote down something that was basically saying, how do I know, what are the markers in my life of maturing and growing as a Christian, as a man, that sort of thing. And what I came up with is, and this is sort of a pattern in my life, but there's two that I thought of. Number one, the person that I am right now, in 5 years, 10 years, there's going to be some stuff about myself that I'm embarrassed about eventually. Different things that I believe, different things that I do, different behaviors, that sort of thing. But that's good. If I'm eventually embarrassed like I am about the person I was 5 and 10 years ago, that means something's changing. That means I'm growing. That means there's a difference, right? But that's number one. But number two, and I think is more important, anyone can learn and grow. Anyone can study Exodus one more time and learn something new and change and be embarrassed about, oh, I used to think this, now I think this. Or anyone can, do that in life. But number two, I think is important too, that when you see the things you're embarrassed about, you can look upon that person with grace, and you can smile with compassion and say, hey, that's all right. I know that guy. I understand that. And I think that's a mark of growth and maturity too, not like self-loathing and hating yourself and like, oh, how stupid or whatever, but to say, okay, to show patience towards yourself, to forgive yourself, to smile with compassion about the things that we used to be but are no longer. That's important too. That doesn't have anything to do with the sermon straightforwardly, but I think that connects up in some subtle ways today. Today we're continuing on in our series in the book of Exodus, and we've made it to Mount Sinai. We made it to Mount Sinai, and today is a sermon about the giving of the law. And we're going to do a whole sermon on the giving of the law and the 10 Commandments, and we're not even going to read any of the laws, except for maybe the very first one. And I want to do that because I want to show you the bookends of this. Exodus 19 and Exodus 24, and the bookends of this giving of the law. Because in that we see the heart of God, we see the character of God, we see the motive for giving of the law. I mean, we could do sermons on, here's this law, and here's what it means, and here's how it applies, and that sort of thing. But to see the heart of the law, the gospel that is present in this situation, you need to see the context in which the law is given. So that's what we're going to do today. So we get to Exodus chapter 19. I got my emergency backup mini Bible here, so let's see if I can read this small print. Exodus 19. And remember last week we had the stuff about the water and came to the mountain and realized that Nobody even cared or noticed the incredible miracle that had happened before them, that when they come to Mount Sinai in this huge oasis, that's kind of like a special secret between Moses and a few other people and God. They just get there. There's no Thanksgiving, no anything. They just arrive to the mountain. And if anything, they're like, well, it's about time there's some water around here. But no comment otherwise on that. But here we are at Mount Sinai, or Horeb in other traditions. And on that third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim, came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. And then Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians." What is God doing here, by the way? He's not saying, "Thus you shall say," and then he starts saying a bunch of laws. He says, here's my message. Say to the house of Jacob, the people of Israel, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you'll indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words that you should speak to the people of Israel. What does God say in the context of giving the law? We're just about there, right? We know Exodus 20 is coming up. There's going to be some laws given. But what does God give to the people? He gives them a story. He gives them the narrative. He reminds them of their history. Here's how we got to this place. This is the goal of Exodus, getting to Sinai. We're going to spend the rest of the time here at this mountain. This is where Exodus has been taking us, to this mountain. And something special happens here, and the law is part of that. The law is good. The law is spiritual, like Paul talks about. But why does God give the law? What is the context? He says, "I bore you on eagle's wings." It's a beautiful image. God saying, I came down, I rescued you, I carried you, I brought you out of Egypt, in this majestic picture that he gives of bury them on eagle's wings. And he says, "And did you know that you are my special treasured possession, my inheritance?" No commands yet. Just want you to know this awesome scene about the eagle. And did you know that you are my treasured piece? Imagine the creator of the universe has a special treasure. He already has everything. Doesn't need anything. But he looks at this sorry lot of people, rescued, liberated slaves out of Egypt, and he says, you know what my treasure is? You know what the most important thing, the most valuable thing to me in all of the world is? You see that small group of people over there? That's mine. And I love it, and I treasure it. You might have something like that around the house that you love or that you treasure. And you probably have people that you love and treasure, and there's no language for that. That's how God feels towards these people. There's inheritance. There's treasured possession, he says. And I've brought you out to be a kingdom of priests. Now there's going to be a priesthood within this group of people, maybe more than one, at least one, but he says all of you have the function of priest. This whole nation of people has this function to carry out. This is the motive for the law. This is why we're giving the law as in the context of this covenant that's being formed here. A kingdom of priests. What does that mean? What is the function of a priest? The priest is not there to lord it over people, to enforce, government. The priest is there as a mediator between the people and God. And God says, I'm calling you. I'm calling you into this covenant relationship because the world needs this. The world needs this mediating presence. the go-between, the thing that draws people near to God, the thing that facilitates that. And a holy nation, same thing, missional in purpose. It's not set apart just to be different and say, oh, you guys stay away, go over there. The holiness, the set apartness of this nation, there's other texts about this in Deuteronomy and so forth, is for the other nations to look at them and to say, hey, did you guys see those people and their laws? Did you see how awesome they are? Think of how awesome their God is. I want to be one of those. I want to be part of that law, that God. Way better than our law and our gods that we have. There's a missional element to this holiness. That's what God is calling the people to do and to be. A kingdom of priests, a holy nation, because of their story of a God who rescued them like an eagle, bearing them on his wings, and a God who brings them out of Egypt because they are his special treasure. And of course, all this is about a covenant, a relationship. What I want us to see here is that this relationship is already in place before any command is given. This covenant is the culmination of this relationship and these promises that have started long before with Abraham and his family. Some scholars even talk about this as like a subcategory of the Abrahamic covenant. We're still in this Abraham promise when we get to Sinai. And the words that we say are in the context of those promises given and those covenants made with Abraham. This isn't just my birthday week, but coming up pretty soon, I also have an important anniversary, important number, 18. It's our 18th anniversary coming up here. And as far as Tabitha and I are concerned, that is the coolest number. There is never going to be a better anniversary than number 18. That's always been our special number in our marriage. That was my baseball number in high school and her softball number in high school. And that's who we were when we started to like each other and to have a crush on each other. And one time we went out on a date to this movie, Dante's Peak. Remember that? And it just went from there. And then one day, a day I'll never forget, and this image I'll never forget, I was standing outside, but in a situation like this with an aisle, and I saw Tabitha come down the aisle, and I know exactly what she looked like. And that day changed my life. That was the culmination of something that had been growing and maturing and fostering in us, this relationship. We didn't meet each other at the altar that day. We made a covenant that day because there was already a relationship, already a story in place, already a history that we shared. And because of that story, that history, we said we want to make these promises to each other today and live out those promises to one another. That's what's going on here at the mountain. There's a history, there's a story, there's a relationship, and God invites them into this covenant, these promises that they're going to exchange and live out. That's what he's asking them to do. He makes promises to them, they make promises to him, and then everything changes. Now, that's not the only thing that defines their relationship. I mean, Tabitha and I have our vows, some promises that we write, and they fit on one sheet of paper. And they're up there on the wall in our bedroom. And do you know how often we reference those? Not very often. We don't. If we're in a situation, I'm like, oh, sorry, not on the list. Not going to do it. It's our relationship in this covenant and these promises are more than just the list of things that we're called to do. That's what I want us to see about the heart of the law that God has given to his people. It's not just a set list, and this is the parameters of everything that God cares about, that these things will never change or grow or be amended or whatever. This is a point in time of God's relationship with his people, and here's what he had to say. But do you know that the first commandment is It actually depends on if you're like Lutheran or Catholic or Jewish, right? Different people have a different way of accounting for these 10 that come in Exodus chapter 20, but everyone gets to 10 somehow in this list in Exodus chapter 20. That means you combine a couple or split one of them up into two. Different people have different ways of getting to number 10. But the very first one, especially if you read this as the Jewish people would and do. In Exodus chapter 20, God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. That was 2. The very first thing that God says here, the very first command, he says to Moses, all right, here it comes. Moses has been up and down the mountain a couple of times. Now Moses joins the people down, and God speaks these things in the hearing and the sight, by the way, of all the people. It's a little bit of a frightening scene because it's God, and God. It's not his fault that he's God, but that's how it is. That was a pretty good joke, I thought. Okay, but he's God, and he's trying to communicate with humans, and here it is. And there's a lot of fear and terror at the mountain, but he speaks these words. Now these are the only things that the people are wanting God to speak, because after a while they're like, Moses, can you talk to us? It's kind of rough when God's face-to-face, voice to ear with us. But he says, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And that's the first command. And it's not even a command. It's the gospel. It's the good news. It's the story of a God who has a special treasure and saves them. That's the context of the law. And this is so important because, in our history as a church for 2,000 years, in our history as churches of Christ, you can get smaller or bigger than that, but this can be a problem sometimes. Sometimes we become very law-oriented, obedience-oriented, and all of that is important, but if you lose the parameters and the bookends and the context of why, then you lose the point. You lose the story. You lose the gospel. This is the first thing that God says. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's number 1. It's not something to do. It's something to remember. It tells you who you are, not what to do. Who God is. That's the gospel, according to Moses, according to Exodus. And he goes on from there, and the commands, and there's actually, after the 10, there's several pages of other commands that go on and on. But we finally get to the end of this section where they're going to ratify the covenant. They've heard some of these commands. They've heard the Big 10. They've heard some other ones. And in Exodus 24, God says to Moses, come up to Yahweh, you, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, 70 of the elders, and come to worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to Yahweh, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses came and told the people all the words that Yahweh had, and all the rules. All the people answered in one voice. They said, all the words that Yahweh has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. And he rose early in the morning, and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Moses took half the blood and he put it in the basins. Half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant. He read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, again, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. They said that before they ever got the laws. They said, whatever God says, we'll do. Now they've heard the laws, and then they still say twice now, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And in light of that, this is the ceremony. This is the beautiful moment. Moses took the blood and threw it on the people, and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant that Yahweh has made with you in accordance with all these words." Takes the blood of the covenant and says that phrase, the blood of the covenant, and makes that true, makes it real through this ritual of blood. And then in a verse section that a lot of people don't even realize is in the Bible, because it seems to contradict some idea that we have about what's supposed to happen between God and humans. But here it is. Moses, this is verse 9. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, 70 of the elders went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven, for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the men or the people of Israel. They saw God, and they ate, and they drank. They saw God, they ate, and they drank with him. This beautiful fellowship meal, this wedding banquet, this covenant banquet, symbolizing the entirety of Israel up there on the mountain, seeing God, eating and drinking with him. So we have the blood of the covenant, and we have this special fellowship meal that takes place. And we have this gospel story on the other side, on the front end of it. Is this story starting to sound familiar? Because it's the one that we enact every day, every week when we come here. It's the one we just did. What does Jesus say at the Last Supper? He takes the phrase from Exodus. This is the blood of the covenant. And he says, but now it's my blood. Now it's my blood. What does Jesus mean by that? He means the same thing that God and that Moses mean when they say it. This blood covers you now. This blood means something. It's creating something. It's creating a people. It's creating a life. It's done in light of a story of salvation, in light of good news of gospel. It is the gospel. And it means something. And Jesus uses that phrase to describe and to help us understand what it is that we're doing when we take the Lord's Supper and what it is that this blood means. And as we read today in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says in verse 9, sorry, I didn't give you this verse, PJ, so you don't need to try to search for it if you don't want to. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." If I wouldn't have told you what verse I was reading, would you have guessed 1 Peter? Would you have guessed Exodus? They sound the same. You know why? Because Peter's taken the language from Exodus and saying, this is that. You guys are doing the same thing. God always has the same mission. God always has the same call. God always has this special treasured possession. And he always has that same call on our hearts and our lives. To be a holy people, a royal priesthood, he says, a holy nation. And we already know what that means because we know Exodus. We've read Exodus. And God is saying, now you're part of that story. Everyone here in this room, you're part of this story, part of this covenant. Part of the covenant, and that Jesus is reinstituting, reframing, renewing at that table. And now we, every time we gather, we remember the blood of the covenant that covers us. And we remember that calling and that commission that we are the royal priesthood, that we are the holy nation for those same missional purposes, Peter says, to proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, to proclaim that same story of that Exodus that we have undergone through Jesus Christ, out of the darkness into the light. That's who we are. That's our story. And we're called to obey. We're called to be obedient, to live into God's will. But now we have the context for understanding why that's important and why we do the things that we do. It's not just because it's a list of commands. It's because of the story of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So may we remember that framework for who we are. May we remember that story. May we live out that calling of being a royal priesthood, a holy people, God's treasured possession. And may we do so to bring the hearts of others to our Savior and Lord. Let's stand and sing.